More than a decade had passed since the end of the war, when a man using the name Riccardo Klement moved discreetly through the suburbs of Buenos Aires. Behind that pseudonym was Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible for organizing the trains that transported millions of Jews to the ghettos and extermination camps. In 1942, he had served as secretary at the Wannsee Conference, where the final solution became state policy. 2 years later, in Hungary, he oversaw the mass deportation to Auschwitz and earned a reputation for continuing the killings, even when high-ranking Nazi officials had ordered them to stop. With Germany's defeat, he fled, was captured by American troops, escaped in 1946, and disappeared under false identities until, in 1950, with the help of a Franciscan friar, he obtained a Red Cross passport and an Argentine visa. For a decade, he led an austere life on the outskirts of the Argentine capital, working in factories and minor trades. But on May 11, 1960, his routine was broken. A Mossad team intercepted him near his home, subdued him, and kept him hidden for 9 days in a safe house. On May 20th, disguised and sedated, he was flown on an El Al flight that had officially arrived to transport the Israeli delegation attending the celebrations of Argentina's 150th independence anniversary. On May 23rd, David Ben-Gurion announced to the world that Eichmann was in an Israeli prison. The news shook international headlines. West Germany refrained from requesting his extradition, and the Soviet Union itself supported the legitimacy of the trial in Israel. Yet the operation sparked a diplomatic storm. Buenos Aires demanded proof that foreign commandos had violated its sovereignty. Israel, in a surprising twist, attempted to deny government involvement and presented the capture as the work of volunteers. That naive and implausible version was even defended by Golda Meir at the United Nations Security Council. Argentina filed a formal protest with the UN, denouncing the action as incompatible with international peace. On June 22nd, after a heated debate, a resolution was passed recognizing the violation of its sovereignty. Israel responded with expressions of sincere regret, while declaring its own ambassador in Buenos Aires persona non grata. Only after weeks of negotiations was an agreement reached. Both governments expressed mutual acknowledgement of grievances and closed the incident with a joint statement. Eichmann, meanwhile, remained under strict custody in Jerusalem. No power would claim him again. The stage was set for a historic trial, although his capture was not an isolated case. It was merely a visible episode in a much larger web of escapes, cover-ups, and clandestine networks. The scene was set for the trial, but understanding how it came to this requires looking back. During the 1950s, Eichmann was a low priority for almost anyone. The Cold War set the agenda, and in Germany and Austria, there was a push to close the chapter on Nazi crimes as quickly as possible. A legal limitation also weighed heavily. The 20-year statute of limitations threatened to protect anyone who remained unprosecuted until 1965. In that climate, voices advocating to turn the page grew louder, even as certain trials, such as the Auschwitz proceedings in Frankfurt, exposed uncomfortable cracks. Israel, too, was not focused on this hunt, absorbing waves of refugees, arming itself against neighboring states, and a bitter social perception of the behavior of the victims took precedence. Many, even in the local press, assumed Eichmann was dead. There were, however, the persistent few who would not let the trail go cold. Tuvia Friedman, operating from a minimal documentary center, applied pressure through lectures and letters. Simon Wiesenthal from Linz and later Vienna gathered leads and files. Their findings circulated through offices, sometimes without acknowledgement or response. The decisive lever emerged in 1957. Fritz Bauer, chief prosecutor in Hesse, alerted the Israeli representation in Bonn that Eichmann was in Buenos Aires. He feared internal leaks that could thwart an extradition or alert the fugitive. Israeli intelligence reacted cautiously. An initial dispatch to Argentina could not confirm the lead, and the matter went cold. In 1959, Bauer returned with more precise information, name and address. This time the message reached Ben-Gurion. The order was clear, a covert operation to capture him. Issa Harel assumed command, however its execution revealed fractures within the team itself. Zvi Aharoni, sent to Buenos Aires to survey the terrain, reproached the service for its initial slowness and documented weeks of surveillance until conclusive photographs were obtained. Zvi Malchin, prepared for the street capture, later questioned Aharoni's role. There were tensions over tactical decisions as specific as who would drive the first car, and others of greater weight, such as who would interrogate the detainee. Harrell appointed Aharoni for his language skills and expertise, and closed off access to prevent leaks. Eichmann was already in Israeli hands. One lingering question remained, one that the trial would not resolve. How had he managed to hide for 10 years in broad daylight in the southern cone? To answer it, one must map the escape routes that made his disappearance possible. First, it is necessary to understand what Ben-Gurion wanted from this trial. Publicly, he did not speak of operational feats, but of purpose: to use the proceedings to expose, with evidence and witnesses, the machinery that led millions of Jews to extermination, and to fix that truth in the consciousness of Israel and the world. He was less interested in the man Eichmann than in the pedagogical power of the trial, a lesson for generations who had grown up hearing only distant echoes. The primary objective was external: to remind the powers that the disaster they had tolerated obliged them to support the only Jewish state. The second, internal: to instill in Israeli youth the significance of the catastrophe, to transform memory into civic identity. For this reason, he insisted that the trial be held in Jerusalem rather than before an international court. He did not seek the appropriate punishment, none could compensate for the damage, but the greatest historical visibility under Israeli sovereignty. This discourse coexisted with a diplomatic blunder that is hard to explain. While his government sent notes denying state responsibility for the capture and attributed the operation to volunteers, other official voices detailed that Israeli services had located and transported the fugitive. The contradiction fueled the crisis with Argentina and left Israel defending itself at the UN, just as it aimed to focus on the judicial narrative. There was also no consensus within the Jewish world about where he should be tried. Nahum Goldman proposed an international tribunal that would include countries victimized by Nazism. Ben-Gurion responded that the priority was not punishment itself, but exposing the criminal system on an Israeli stage. This stance quickly evolved into a broader debate. In year-end interviews, the Prime Minister linked Holocaust education with the fight against contemporary anti-Semitism and, controversially, associated the anti-Israel propaganda of certain Arab regimes with ideological legacies of Nazism. He also appealed to the diaspora. Israel had to be the gravitational center of the Jewish people, not a secondary option. His words sparked angry responses in the United States. Community committees and rabbis accused Ben-Gurion of drawing a boundary between inside and outside Israel that delegitimized fully American Jewish identities. He later clarified that he was addressing specifically Orthodox sectors that link religious commandments to the land of Israel, citing Talmudic sources to contextualize his message. But the fire was already lit. The trial would emerge surrounded by political expectations, theological suspicion, and a tense international climate. The controversy over his statements soon eased. Even Nahum Goldman, Ben-Gurion's political rival, clarified that the American press had taken phrases out of context and that the English translation arrived days late, fueling misunderstandings. When the full text was published, it became clear that the Prime Minister was not demanding that the entire diaspora emigrate immediately, but rather maintain an active connection with Israel through visits, investment, and sending young people to study as a minimum duty for those who identified as Zionists. The message, however, was wrapped in rhetoric of total commitment. The independence of the state was an end in itself, and in the face of assimilation in free countries or oppression in dictatorships, it was urgent to strengthen Hebrew education and practical ties with Jerusalem. This call resonated with internal tensions. Mappai's Ashkenazi hegemony was being challenged by the massive arrival of Jews from Arab countries, for whom the memory of European extermination was not a personal experience. Added to this was the fallout from the Kastner case, which had tainted the official narrative about resistance and rescue during the war. In that landscape, Ben-Gurion found it useful to have a unifying event, capable of refocusing national identity and restoring the authority of the establishment. Externally, matters were no simpler. Influential leaders of American Jewry questioned Israel's right to speak on behalf of all Jews. Some proposed an international tribunal, others suggested handing Eichmann over to the Federal Republic. Strategic considerations also weighed heavily. Washington was watching closely, and Bonn was already a key partner in funding and armaments. Relations with West Germany were turbulent. German technicians and scientists collaborated with Egypt on military programs, and Israeli covert actions to stop them were exposed in Europe, leaving a trail of distrust. Paradoxically, Eichmann's effect in Germany was immediate. Following his arrival in Jerusalem, arrests and trials multiplied against mid-level officials involved in deportations. Many had not even changed their names. The Israeli press, for its part, heightened the moral tone to the maximum and treated the accused's ultimate fate as a foregone conclusion. What was Ben-Gurion ultimately seeking? More than exemplary punishment, it was a pedagogical and political act. He ordered the fugitive to be brought without waiting for an improbable extradition, and turned the trial into a stage from which to explain why the state existed and why it needed to be upheld. His motivations evolved over time, but the outcome was clear. The Holocaust came to occupy the center of Israeli civic memory and radiated outward to the West as a shared moral narrative. Meanwhile, the question that drives us to the next step remains. What infrastructures, accomplices, and documents allowed a man like Eichmann to disappear for an entire decade in the Southern Cone? The answer is called the Ratline. In March 1945, an emissary from Himmler's apparatus landed in Madrid with a Porteño accent. Horst Carlos Fuldner, a former SS officer, polyglot, and expert in administrative tricks, carrying fresh money to grease doors. His arrival, just weeks before Hitler's suicide, sparked a corridor that would remain active until the early 1950s, with a preferred destination, post-war Argentina. The context pushed it forward. Europe was saturated with displaced persons and prisoners. Spain, Switzerland, and Portugal functioned as waiting rooms. Austria and Italy offered porous corners, and anti-communism became a useful pass with Western offices, while Nuremberg opened a front of criminal liability. Madrid operated as a first line. Retreating French and Belgian collaborators mixed with Reich contacts. Among the newcomers were figures who would later reappear in the Rio de la Plata: Charles Lesker, the Belgian Pierre Day, and Romanian diplomat Radu Gânea. Hidden in discreet apartments, they prepared the Atlantic leap. Fuldner, the ideal hinge, born in Buenos Aires, raised in Cassel with dual nationality and a zigzagging biography of promotions, debts, and escapes, moved again under diplomatic cover, with artworks to liquidate and rehearsed routes between the Iberian Peninsula and Berlin. What was then fog became clear through its effects. The network extended from Madrid to Buenos Aires and branched towards Sweden, Switzerland, and Italy. To scale up, an organizer with access to borders and consulates was needed. That brain was in motion: Lesker. In August 1944, he traveled to Berlin, secured his exit, and already in Saint-Jean-de-Luz began preparing the emigration. The logistical nerve center beat on the Spanish side. In Hendaye and San Sebastián operated Peña, a Franco regime office that recruited fugitives from Vichy. Lesker arrived in Madrid on a special flight, with a false identity and funds. The German embassy contributed millions of pesetas. Lufthansa offered itineraries. Around the table at the Horscher restaurant, a new node of conspiracies, sat Day, Gânea, and Vichy operators. Proof of the network emerged quickly. The German-Argentine banker Carlos Reuter flew from Bilbao to Buenos Aires, validated the circuit, and prepared the reception. In 1946, gradual shipments began from Cadiz with Spanish documentation. Lesker made his own transfer via the Cape of Good Hope, and despite setbacks in Brazil and Uruguay, eventually settled in the Argentine capital with military backing. What was missing was the seal that would turn fugitives into displaced persons with clean papers. The trail led to Rome. That bishop with stamps had both a name and a network. On January 18, 1946, Antonio Caggiano, Bishop of Rosario and a key figure in Catholic action, travelled to Italy to be made a cardinal by Pius XII, accompanied by Agustin Barrère. They were not mere pilgrims. They carried a pastoral agenda and another discreetly political one. In Genoa, Consul Aquilino Lopez handled the logistics. The Pope sent penicillin during Caggiano's convalescence, and during those days, Caggiano visited the Pontifical Commission for Assistance, PCA, at Villa San Francesco, invited its president to Argentina, and reinforced the channel that provided Vatican identities to refugees and to no small number of collaborators. Through that channel also operated the Croatian Krunoslav Draganovic, supplying transit papers. Cardinal Eugene Tisserant added the doctrine. Fear of Soviet advance turned the compromised into anti-communist reserves exploitable in South America. At the Argentine consulate in Rome, Emilio Bertolotto issued tourist visas, bypassing requirements when mediated by the signature of the new cardinal, while Red Cross passports were processed in parallel. Giovanni Battista Montini, future Paul VI, explored a broader migration agreement with Buenos Aires. Meanwhile, Caggiano was celebrated in Spain, and on May 9th sailed via the Cape of Good Hope alongside Émile de Watine, an aeronautical designer who would end up in the Pulci project. In October, Fernand de Menou, Robert Pansemin and Lesker himself arrived. The route had shifted from exception to routine. At the Casa Rosada, the machinery took shape as policy. Perón not only opened the door, he defined the why. In his Madrid memoirs, he admitted that Nuremberg struck him as an affront to military honor, and he decided to shelter as many officers as he could. This conviction translated into a structure, the Information Division, with Rodolfo Rudi Freude as its pivot, and, in its wake, the CID. Rudi, and the weight of the Freud clan, ensured political and business channels. In that climate, Santiago Peralta, an openly anti-Semitic anthropologist, arrived at the Migration Office with a National Ethnic Institute, secret maps, and an agenda that blocked Jewish refugees. From the Freude-Peralta alliance emerged the operational apparatus, the Argentine Ratline. The first cogs travelled from Madrid and Rome. Fuldner, now acting as Perón's special envoy and operator of the DAIE in Genoa, coordinated permits, the Air Force and the docks. Alongside him moved Jacques de Mailleux, the Count Gino Monti de Valsacina, the Croatian Branko Benzon, Georges Guilbault, Pierre Day, René Lagrue, Herbert Helfrich, a key figure in Switzerland, the Dukansky brothers, Czesław Smolinski, Radu Genea, and the Spanish journalist Victor de la Serna, valuable for his Red Cross contacts. In early December 1947, Day, Lagrue and Guilbault, all with death sentences in their home countries, entered the presidential office with Freud. Fuldner, Genea and de la Serna were present. Later, the Central Bank and the Air Force joined. There, routes, cover identities, jobs and suitcases were secured. Rome became a sanctuary. Alois Hudal, rector of Santa Maria dell'Anima and a confessed admirer of the Reich, turned anti-communist protector, requested 5,000 visas from Perón in 1948. The PCA had tasked him with the Austrian chapter, funded by American charitable donations that, in practice, supported documentation and shelters. Operating alongside him were Draganovic and former intelligence officer Reinhard Kops, the latter undercover in a religious library, coordinated with the DAIE and learned in Genoa from Franz Ruffinengo, who interleaved fugitives into shipping lists at the last minute. Monsignor Karl Bayer on Via Piave facilitated safe conducts and letters that opened the door to Red Cross passports. Dr. Willie Nix created identities and housed candidates before their jump to the Ligurian docks. When the police closed in, he took refuge behind the Vatican threshold. Genoa was the springboard. Archbishop Siri promoted emigration committees. Auxilium coordinated logistics. Monsignor Carlo Petranovic, a former Ustasha captain, gathered contingents that embarked under ecclesiastical seals. Between 1947 and 1949, Allied surveillance caught some, but many sailed with pastoral letters and disembarked in Buenos Aires without incident. At the port, DAIE teams identified special cases who avoided common areas or disembarked via small boats before docking. The labeling system also traveled: white, grey and black. On paper, a boundary. In practice, a blurred gradation. Washington protested. London admitted requesting Vatican assistance for grey cases to South America. In the offices of Buenos Aires, no one was fooled. They were German and non-German Nazis. Cops, now under the alias Juan Mahler, arrived on September 4, 1948. He was received by Eugene Rupnik, installed at the Hotel de Inmigrantes, and issued documentation within hours. His mentor, Rufinengo, had established a travel agency famous among exiles. Soon Mahler was writing for Der Weg, a magazine edited at Dürer House by Ludwig Freude, which articulated the cultural and logistical ecosystem of the Nazi exile. Banned in Germany and Austria, it thrived in Buenos Aires. Under cassocks and aliases, darker figures crossed as well. Walter Kutschmann arrived in 1948 with a Carmelite identity, received administrative support from the Casa Rosada, and rose in a German subsidiary. Years later, when his name surfaced, the files went missing. Ecclesiastical cover continued to grease higher-level operations. Klaus Barbie was handed to Draganovich in 1951. With signatures from the Red Cross and DAIE, he passed through Argentina en route to Bolivia, greeted in a manner unbefitting a consulate. The architecture had names at every level: cardinals, bishops, priests, and at the Buenos Aires terminal, Perón's DAIE. Through these channels circulated Friedrich Rauch, the one with the Reichsbank gold, Hans Fischberg, treasurer of the Dutch expropriations, Bernhard Heilig, who would end up in Capri alongside Eichmann, and Franz Stangl, received by Hudal with papers nearly ready. From there, the seals were synchronized, the ports lubricated, and the last knots remained to be tied. The flow of money and names through Swiss banking engineering, and the political cover sufficient so that, on the other side of the Atlantic, no one asked too many questions. If Rome was the sanctuary, Bern became the hinge. In the shadow of Evita's Rainbow Tour, which opened doors in Madrid, the Vatican and Switzerland, the Peronist network mounted its boldest move. A clandestine office at Marktgasse 49, presented as the Argentine Emigration Center, but actually run by Carlos Fuldner and his associates. With official passports and diplomatic cover, the men of the Information Division polished a corridor that blended real technicians with illustrious fugitives. Through that route would pass Eichmann, Mengele, Bohner, Priebke and Schwamberger. The political climate helped. In Bern, Justice Minister Eduard von Steiger and his right-hand man, Police Chief Heinrich Rothmund, gave the green light with one condition: discretion. The formal screen was provided by Major Benito Llambi, a friend of Perón and head of the legation. Lubrication came through bribes and the promise of cabins for war victims who would share ships with Nazis bound for Buenos Aires. Memories of old connections with the SD, Schellenberg had dealt with Swiss High Command during the war, smoothed the path further. The apparatus was completed with a recruitment arm and an extraction arm. Colonel Rodolfo Jeckeln hunted for useful profiles: scientists, engineers, NSDAP members, and even SS personnel, backed financially by Fritz Mandl. The crown jewel was Nazi architect Herbert Helfrich, a veteran of highways, fortifications, and V2 platforms, who arrived in Buenos Aires in July 1947, and 2 months later returned to Europe as a field agent. His Helfrich mission wove clandestine routes from occupied Germany to Switzerland, or directly to Italy, KLM vouchers, quotas in Genoa, and farmer flights. Behind it, diplomat Enrique Moss, well connected to Swiss banking, handled papers, funds, and stamps from Marktgasse itself. Thus, between compliant Swiss stamps, diplomatic suitcases, and altered shipping lists, the Swiss connection turned the Roman sanctuary into an operational bridge. The facade spoke of technicians for Argentine modernization, the inventory of men who should be before the Nuremberg tribunal, not in Argentina. The Swiss backdrop was decisive. In 1938, Bern had agreed with Berlin to mark Jewish passports with a J. By 1942, Police Chief Heinrich Rothmund had ordered guards to close the border to them. There were suicides at the checkpoints, a horror that left him unmoved. Paradoxically, that same apparatus, with Eduard von Steiger as minister and later president, would later facilitate the transit of Nazis to Argentina. After the war, Steiger negotiated with Schellenberg an exchange of Jews for foreign currency, and Rothmund, despite his record, represented Switzerland in the OYR, while in Buenos Aires, migration oscillated between seeing the OYR as an anti-communist barrier or a Jewish gate. In that climate appeared Perón's emissary, Czesław Smolinski. On December 23, 1947, he offered Rothmund a way to bypass consular formalities and obtain direct from Buenos Aires disembarkation permits, with the tacit condition of excluding Jews. A few days later, 127 authorizations arrived. The Swiss legation celebrated, and Smolinski was presented as a man of the presidential circle. From that point on, visits to Marktgasse became routine. Alongside Smolinski and Fuldner, Colonel Gualterio Ahrens and diplomat Enrique Moss finalized a scheme with Rothmund. Swiss transit visas even for those who could not obtain Allied exit permits. Bern would make exceptions, and in return could interview technicians and embark a quota of refugees on the same ships that carried Nazis from Genoa. Washington knew and could do little. The arrangement was perfect for KLM, with Swissair as agent in Zurich, and for Swiss officials who collected up 200,000 francs for temporary papers. The Schlottermann family and other cases showed that with an ersatz pass, an Argentine visa and no transit visa, one could fly to Buenos Aires without hindrance. The Netherlands refused to pressure KLM. Switzerland did not require exit visas. The flow continued. When a mishap threatened to blow the pact, the Swiss employee Samuel Pomeranz from the Marktgasse office was detained trying to transport engineer Erich Bachem across Lake Constance. Rothmund extinguished the fire with calls, reprimands, and pragmatism. He allowed entry, prohibited Pomeranz from entering the area, and then listened to his map of the network: Smolinski the idealist, Ahrens the soldier, Moss with technicians, Helfrich for the rest. Pomeranz concluded with the Soviet ghost. If Argentina did not take them, Moscow would. Ships for Buenos Aires were already diverted to Russia, trains ended up in the USSR, and even British deceptions existed. With that argument, the Swiss connection gained time and continued operating. After the Constanza Lake setback, Rothmund attempted to straighten out the Marktgasse office with repeated reprimands. Moss acted as conciliator, and Helfrich took the hard line, but promises evaporated once they left the office. The Nazi rescue continued as before. When Rothmund demanded that victims be prioritized, recalling 9,000 refugees in Switzerland, fewer than 4,000 Jews, they promised a solution from above. Miguel Miranda, president of the Argentine Central Bank, would travel to Switzerland, and in the meantime, only 13 refugees embarked to Buenos Aires, without quality material, Helfrich admitted. The coup de grace came from above. On April 15th, in the office of Justice Minister Eduard von Steiger, Argentine mission chief Benito Llambi, ex-SS Carlos Fuldner, and diplomat Guillermo Speroni formalized the cooperation. They requested the full list of refugees with explicit ethnic origin, a euphemism to filter out Jews, and Steiger said Rothmund's department would provide it. Without mentioning Marktgasse or the illegal entries, the political nod secured the operation. Zehnder again requested closure. Rothmund gained time, shifting the practical part to Genoa and reserving the diplomatic side in Bern. Already integrated into the route, Rothmund even accepted a presentation by Fuldner to the key Vatican priest Krunoslav Dragonovich in Rome. Soon after, the Bern police documented that Marktgasse did not assist refugees. It was a front for housing Nazis from Austria and Germany, with Max, Bub and Albert Steiner at the border, and Swiss Colonel Schaufelberger admitting they acted according to Rothmund. Even so, the office survived. In September 1948, Fuldner wrapped up in Europe and set sail for Buenos Aires. On the same voyage was Hubert von Blücher, connected to the concealment of the Reichsbank's treasure that SS Colonel Friedrich Rauch had moved to the Alps. Behind them remained debts, a traffic collision in Bern without proper papers, a freehold apartment on Weststrasse, where his wife, the Nazi Hanna Kraus, proclaimed that Switzerland was part of Germany. Diplomatic plates that could be hidden from the Russians, guests camping in the courtyard, and unpaid bills, including 6 typewriters adapted to Spanish. Pomeranz had to cover expenses at the Schweizerhof and for the landlady. In return, she revealed Fuldner's Buenos Aires address, a clue that later linked him to the reception of a war criminal. With the noise mounting, Rothmund and the police consulted the Swiss legation in Buenos Aires. Its head, Eduard Fehr, began sending scathing warnings about Fuldner. With the scandal already out of control, Swiss Minister Councillor Eduard Fehr launched a diplomatic offensive to rein in the Marktgasse trio: Carlos Fuldner, Herbert Helfrich and Barbara Weiss. He confirmed their direct protection from the Casa Rosada via Rodolfo Freude and warned that touching Fuldner would mean crossing one of Perón's most influential men. His sources, Samuel Pomeranz and Czesław Smolinski, described a landscape of bribes, weapons facilitated by Swiss agent Schaufelberger, and special funds to grease bureaucratic processes. Fehr also clarified the true operational command in Rome: Krunoslav Draganovic, the priest who pulled the important strings for embarking Catholic refugees outside Soviet reach. Pomeranz estimated about 300 people were transported by Fuldner from Germany, only 40 real technicians for the Air Force. Smolinski added that many should be before the Nuremberg tribunal, not in Argentina. Even with Rothman's desk flooded with evidence, the police chief continued giving Fuldner the benefit of the doubt. He even admitted in writing that he had exported him to Buenos Aires so he would cause less damage than in Europe. Fuldner never returned to Switzerland. Helfrich and Weiss did, reappearing in early 1949, while France requested to inspect Marktgasse and Caritas in Bern. The file fell into the hands of Swiss diplomat Jacques-Albert Coutat, an old Lambi contact, who secured the Argentine office and diverted attention toward Paris. Marktgasse closed in the spring of 1949, but the mission was accomplished. The permits issued in 1948 fueled arrivals from Genoa until 1950. The results were stark. For every ordinary refugee sent to Argentina, 3 Nazis managed to escape. According to Rothman, of 127 refugees with permission, 34 travelled. Of another 200, only 49. Meanwhile, another piece of the network emerged. Colonel Henri Guisan, son of the Swiss commander-in-chief, a close friend of Lambi, who assisted Germans with papers and connected Buenos Aires with rocket technicians from von Braun's circle, including preliminary discussions on V3 plans, while also participating in shady arms dealings in Argentina. Opaque areas remain: presidential relative Edgardo Benavente Perón operating between Bern and Rome, emissary Jorge Oscar coordinating with Swiss official Ernesto Heer, and concrete operations such as the rescue of Dr. Otto Wallimann, an expert in foot and mouth disease, extracted from the Soviet-controlled area of Berlin with help from a Swiss colonel and the French military attaché, en route to Genoa. Thus, the web orchestrated by Perón, church officials, sympathetic Swiss bureaucrats, diplomatic cover, and an office in Bern, operated like an industrial chain of evasion, whose threads ultimately converged in Buenos Aires. And once that network was fully extended over Europe, attention returned to Perón himself, exiled in Madrid, speaking openly about his ties with Reich fugitives. In a 1970 conversation with Tomás Eloy Martínez, he recalled a German geneticist who visited him in Olivos in the 1950s, a flawless Bavarian, cultured, who introduced himself as Dr. Gregor. Years later, when the skull and alias surfaced, the puzzle fit. Helmut Gregor was the cover identity of Josef Mengele. The Red Cross would validate the document. Intelligence papers would confirm his travels to Paraguay from the early 1950s. None of this happened in isolation. Luftwaffe ace Hans-Ulrich Rudel, a key figure in aiding fleeing comrades, protected Mengele in the southern cone. Orbiting around him were names like Willem Sassen, chronicler of the Nazi diaspora and frequent visitor to the Casa Rosada. In Olivos, lesser-known but equally tainted figures appeared. A former SS officer, Herbert Habel, recounted how Perón, after a conversation in German, cleared the way for him to reclaim his legal identity in court. Habel was no stranger. He had operated alongside Franz Ruffinengo and Reinhard Kopps, 2 gears of the Perón rescue network, and dealt with Eichmann when the latter worked for Carlos Fuldner's firm. Meanwhile, Dr. Gregor completed his transformation. After fleeing Allied camps without the blood tattoo that marked SS members, he spent years hiding as a laborer in Bavaria. In 1948, he activated his second life. Professionals along the Italian Ratline built him a biography as a German from South Tyrol. In Termeno, he obtained an identity card. With that borrowed name and a disembarkation permit already granted from Buenos Aires, he was ready for the next step. He was not alone. In the same weeks, Other operatives, Priebke, Schwamberger, accelerated procedures with the migration delegation in Europe, led by Fuldner. Financial support was ample. The family agricultural machinery business in Günzburg, rehabilitated after denazification, was expanding toward South America. Once Argentine confirmation arrived, the fugitive left the Bavarian farm without farewells, returned to his hometown to hide, and with help from old contacts, crossed into Italy. In Vipiteno, a boarding house awaited with fresh money. In Bolzano, a liaison with access to the Red Cross and Argentine consulate reserved him a spot on a transatlantic ship bound for the Rio de la Plata. On May 16th in Genoa, Gregor went to collect his new passport. The next day, en route for the visa, the network continued operating silently, and the Ratline, already proven, pushed him toward embarkation. Returning to that journey, upon presenting himself at the Red Cross in Genoa, a clerical error nearly derailed the plan. The issue date was written where the expiration should have appeared, rendering the passport invalid. Once corrected, Gregor proceeded to the DAYE office on Via Albaro for the health inspection. What he found there, reused instruments without hygiene, was recorded in his notebook with a mixture of bewilderment and alarm. The final step, the Italian exit visa, ran into bureaucracy. The usual officer was absent, the bribe fell into the wrong hands, and the aspiring emigrant ended up in a Genoa cell until his liaison, Kurt, rescued him. Days later, he boarded the North King, bound for the Rio de la Plata. The arrival was rough. At the Buenos Aires port, immigration agents became uneasy upon seeing vials and technical notes in the suitcase of the newcomer, traveling as a mechanic. They called the health doctor. Unable to read German, he dismissed the issue and allowed the passenger entry. The first days passed in a damp room at the Hotel Palermo, and with the unacceptable offer of a labourer position at a textile connected to the Schlottmanns. The landscape changed when he was welcomed into the columned house of Gerard Malbrain in Florida. There, at last, he was surrounded by a supportive network. Soon, old names from the diaspora began to visit him. Willem Sassen acted as a bridge, and Hans-Ulrich Rudel, who had arrived the previous year with a Red Cross passport under the name Emilio Meyer, integrated him into the circle orbiting around Der Weg, the Aeronautics Institute, and the salons where Perron distributed favors and licenses. This Rudel-Sassen tandem would extend its influence for decades, navigating hydroelectric contract negotiations and advisory roles with regional dictatorships, with episodes worthy of a noir novel, discreet codes at airports and improvised safe conducts. At the same time, South America began to appear as a natural market for the family's agricultural machinery. By the mid-1950s, the patriarch traveled to Buenos Aires with his interpreter, Gregor, and forged alliances with Roberto Mertig, owner of Orbis, and a longtime figure in the German apparatus in the capital. Within this constellation, synecdoches of the system were never absent: an embassy that issued a passport under a real name, a local company that offered employment to illustrious newcomers. The refuge, however, would not be eternal. By 1958, Martha, a sister-in-law turned wife, arrived. They bought a house in Olivos and established Fadro Farm. But the accumulation of warning signs, a political shift in Buenos Aires, open cases in German courts, a detention for unlicensed medical practice, eroded the sense of impunity. The death of his father deepened the drift. Before an extradition request could be processed, he crossed into Paraguay. Eichmann's capture in 1960 set a new threshold of risk. From that moment on, the life of Dr. Gregor was confined to porous borders, occasional visits from Rudel, and an exile that would eventually lead him to a Brazilian beach and a denouement without remorse. The story we have traced is not merely a catalogue of escapes and captures, of false passports and secret operations. Above all, it is a portrait of a time when the line between justice and impunity became blurred. From the quiet streets of Buenos Aires to discreet offices in Bern or Rome, a network was woven that allowed the Reich's executioners to reinvent themselves under new identities. Where some governments facilitated the transit of fugitives, others dedicated extraordinary resources to locate them. The Ratline was not only a path of escape, it reflected a world that at the war's end chose between memory and oblivion, between complicity and pursuit. What we have seen throughout this journey reveals the fragility of international mechanisms for addressing crimes of such magnitude. Eichmann's capture demonstrated that determination could overcome clandestinity, but it also exposed the limits of diplomacy. At the same time, the presence of men like Barbie or Mengele in Latin America highlighted how political and strategic interests often prevailed over justice. In this ambiguous terrain emerged tireless hunters and powerful accomplices. Wiesenthal, the Mossad, and European courts confronted governments that preferred to look the other way or even provide protection to fugitives. The Cold War intensified this contradiction. For some, the enemy was no longer defeated Nazism, but rising communism, and through that lens, former criminals became useful pawns. The lesson is clear. Justice is not measured solely by verdicts, but by the perseverance of those who refuse to forget. Because behind every name, behind every invented alias, there were thousands of silenced victims who never had a voice in those offices where the fate of their executioners was decided. Some were found, tried, and convicted. Klaus Barbie faced a tribunal in Lyon, Franz Stangl, in a Brazilian prison. But others, like Josef Mengele, lived for decades in the shadows, protected by networks of complicity, dying with impunity far from their victims. The hunt for Nazis did not always bring full justice. It was often a race against time, a struggle between the memory of survivors and the silence of those who sought to bury the truth. Yet every capture, every declassified file, every recovered testimony kept one certainty alive, that the darkest crimes do not disappear with the years. Today, more than 70 years later, those pursuits still speak to us. They remind us that justice may be slow, but it never expires, that the duty of memory belongs to everyone, not just the victims. As Simon Wiesenthal, the most relentless of Nazi hunters, wrote, "Justice has no expiration date." That is the legacy of the Nazi hunt, the conviction that even when executioners try to escape, the truth always ends up catching them.